afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the sanctuary of St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Church. If you were here for worship today, or otherwise welcome, especially to those of you who may not have been here before. We're so glad to have you. I'm Canon John Denaro. I am the rector or pastor of St. Anne's, and about what you're about to be part of is our 2022 Women's History Month event. We at St. Anne's, thanks in large part to our member Nancy Nicoletti and others who have helped her in the cause of acknowledging and celebrating Women's History Month, we for very many years would host an event we called Unsung Heroines on a particular day in March. And we would share stories here from members of the congregation presenting on women who had made great contributions to our common life as Americans and sometimes as citizens of the world, and whose accomplishments were little known or unknown. Last year we held, was it just last year that we held the Women of STEM? Yes. Last year we held an event online that was quite wonderful, and it, like in years past, it featured members of the congregation presenting about women, unknown, unsung women. And this year we, for lots of reasons, decided to scale back a bit, but I think this will be as expansive and full and a presentation as any we've had, and we're very blessed to welcome today Lisa Easton, who is the architect. I said, our architect at church today, and I said, well, no, she didn't design this building, but she is a quite phenomenal architect who has helped in many ways our efforts to preserve our historic, our landmark, two buildings, our parish house, and is now helping us look at how we can address some great concerns that you'll be hearing about today on the church building itself. I don't want to take too much more time, but I do want to mention that when I asked Lisa if she would consider doing this today, she said yes so quickly that it made me nervous. I was, but to me, as I think about it, it indicates her enthusiasm for her work, and I think also for this church that she has come to know as well, if not better, than many of us. I only want to add, and Lisa will surely say more about herself, but I want to say that as you read in our promotion for this event, Lisa is one of the few directors of or owners of a firm that is women-owned. And I don't know if that's just in the preservation world or in general. In general. And I know that when Lisa comes to work directly here, in other words, when she's engaged in her work on this building personally and in person, that there's often a great crowd of men around her, but she is in the lead. And those men are sometimes from engineering firms and from some of the other contractors that we have worked with. But Lisa's firm is a firm largely of women. And that has struck me as very intentional. I know your husband's on the website too, but no.
And you're my dad.
And your dad, God rest his soul. So, this really is about celebrating women in the field of architecture. And Lisa has also agreed to share some about some unsung heroines in the field of architecture. So this is a blending of events. But you may be setting a new tradition and a new standard for us. So thank you, Lisa. Thank you all so much for joining us. And without further ado, please help me welcome Lisa Easton.
Thank you, Ken and John, and thank you everyone for joining us today. That was a beautiful intro, and part of what I was so excited about was that, yes, I'm an architect, I'm a woman, and I specialize in preservation and adaptive use of old structures. And so when I was asked to give the lecture, I wanted to not only focus, we want to wrap up and focus on the church, that'll be the conclusion of the lecture, but I wanted to start with why I was an architect, or my inspiration, and the unsung heroes that have affected me and impacted me. And so when I was laying out the presentation, I was thinking of, well, what should I put on the cover? And I thought it would be great if there were some images of Rosie the Riveter, or something about women breaking out of that role of being in the kitchen and working in the field, and in a field that's predominantly, still to this day, a man's world. So I selected a few women here, and they date back to a whole range of time frames, all pre-World War II, when they actually were educated, if they were educated in the field of architecture, and some great pioneers. So for today, I wanted to focus on 3 important people to me. And 2 come from California, hail from California, and I wanted to bring it closer to home with one here from New York. Then I'd like to just focus a little bit on what I do, what I've been doing here at the Parish House, and now what we're going to look forward to here at the church. So, Carlos, if we could start the first slide, please. So the 3 women I'd like to focus on the left is Lillian Rice. In the center is Julia Morgan, and on the right is Natalie Dubloy. And so 3 very different women from very different time frames, practicing architecture in very different ways. I selected these 3 photos because I wanted you to see them at work. Julia Morgan is probably one of the most prolific women architects. I'll talk about her when I get to her piece. But she actually set the standard for attire, or the woman's architecture uniform. And she chose, instead of wearing trousers on a site, she chose to wear a long skirt and boots. And so she stayed with that till she retired at the age of 79. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with Lillian Rice. So Lillian Rice, she was born in 1889, and she had a very short life, unfortunately. She passed away in 1938 at the age of 49. She hails from National City in the San Diego County, and she graduated from the University of Berkeley with a Bachelor of Letters in 1910. And why a Bachelor of Letters, you ask? Because they didn't have a School of Architecture yet. So she worked in the field with Bernard Maybeck. He was a prolific architect out of San Francisco, known for his very interpretive style of organic architecture and built form. And that really heavily influenced her. And so for me, Lillian Rice, I've always admired her because she was a straight-laced woman. She was really known for her simplicity of design and her simplicity of lifestyle as well. So she worked for a lot of firms, male-dominated, of course, but she chose her own route. She chose her own voice, and she stuck to it till the day she died. And so I was going to show a few pieces of work here. Another reason why she's influenced me is because she was actually practicing preservation or restoration long before we ever gave it a term or a word. And so on the right is an adobe structure that dates to the 1700s, and when she was asked to restore it, she was asked by the Bartow family to restore it, and it was around 1926, 1927 when she was actually able to restore it in its true vernacular form and by technology as well. So for her, technology of materials was really the focus of her practice and her philosophy, which I align with heavily. I think Ken and John probably knows that. I'm a real techniques and methods kind of girl. So on the right, I just wanted to show you too, when I was selecting photos, I wanted to try and put these women in their place. So in their place of work. So here in the photo on the left, Lillian Rice is the one sitting on the bumper of the car. Again, she would wear trousers. If you remember the previous slide, I chose that photo because she actually is in her trousers, and she actually volunteered to drive the truckloads of concrete to the site because there was a worker strike, and she drove the truck for 3 weeks delivering concrete. So she didn't necessarily prescribe to the skirt like Julia Morgan did all the time. But she certainly was a trendsetter in her own right. Next slide, please. What I do want to sort of highlight is for all three of these women, they worked in a field that was predominantly male. And where they drew their influence and their support was from the women in their life. And by that I mean the sororities which they were living in when they were at college. They met philanthropists, academicians, people who would support them in a role as mentors and friends. And that really led to many of Lillian's commissions. And this one is a unique one. It's a rowing club. And there were many, I think at the height of the rowing phenomenon in the San Diego area, there were somewhere around 40 of these rowing clubs just for women. This one, however, is still there. It's still functioning. It's the lone surviving one left. So she was really inspired by these women. She became the president of this rowing club. She was really involved, not only in her work, but in who used her work, how people occupied her buildings, and she really thought long and hard about that. Next slide, please. These are some images from the Library of Congress. And again, you see the simplicity of form. Its style is very tectonic, it's very practical. There's not a lot of superfluous ornament or anything. It's about what the function of the building is and how you use it. And she too, like Julia Morgan and like Natalie Dubloy, you'll see, they designed from the inside out. So the exterior was important, but the interior was as important, if not more so, in guiding their design direction. Next slide, please. This is the building today, how it looks today. So it still survives. As I mentioned, it's the lone women's rowing club left in the San Diego area. Next slide, please. So Lillian's magnum opus, I'll call it, is a plan for a town called Rancho Santa Fe, which is about 25 miles outside of San Diego. I'm not sure if any of you have been. I've had the pleasure of seeing it firsthand, and I think that's actually where I first learned of Lillian Rice. And it is magnificent. And so these are a few images of the structures that she was in charge of designing. So at the time she was working for a firm. And it was a firm that was hired to develop about an 8,000-acre tract of land that was formerly the Santa Fe Railroad Company land. So they wanted to develop it into a neighborhood, an enclave. I won't call it a suburb. It was designed to be a planned community in the sense that it integrated nature. So Lillian was given the charge. She was the supervisor of this whole development, so she laid out the plan for it, she laid out the infrastructure for it, and then she subsequently designed over 100 houses within this enclave. I would point out that another sort of aspect that I align with her on, so this is recognized on a national level, this community. Recently, 11 of her buildings were named in that. It's not a thematic nomination, it's a multi-property nomination. 11 of the privately owned homes are listed in the National Register now, and 8 more are soon to follow. Next slide, please. So here I circle Lillian, and she was drawing, these are a few of her college friends and college sorority sisters who were also pursuing employment in the fields of engineering and architecture. And so she would draw from this group, this community, to find her inspiration and her motivation. And she was very determined, and she set her mind to doing it, and she did it very successfully. So the firm that she was working at, they had the utmost confidence in her. And the whole plan development for Rancho Santa Fe spanned about a 10-year period from design, inception to fruition. And so in that time frame, Lillian went out on her own, and she started her own firm. So it's the inspiration for a women-owned firm right there. And her employers led her on her way, wished her much success, and she successfully is the name behind Rancho Santa Fe. And so today, it's a homeowners association. It's a very wealthy enclave, and they still follow her mandate for design guidelines. So they really appreciate and respect her intuition, her sensibility, and her architectural style. Out of Rancho Santa Fe, what she's been credited with is creating the Spanish colonial revival style as an architectural hallmark for the state of California. So we know the tile roofs, the white stucco, and she is really single-handedly the woman behind that, where she planned a whole community influenced by the vernacular architecture coming up from Mexico and the indigenous adobe structures she was working around. So she's very, in my mind, she's really a trendsetter in architectural style for the state of California. Next slide, please. These are two, well, one on the right actually is an office building where she had her office for many years until she died. She actually worked up until her death at the age, as I mentioned, of 49, sadly. And on the left is one of the larger homes that she did design in Rancho Santa Fe. Next slide, please. And this is a beautiful Library of Congress photo of the interior and the exterior, and these two houses I've just showed you are two that are listed now in the National Register of Historic Places. Her involvement with Rancho Santa Fe opened her up to a network of people who would be influenced by her, shall I say. And so one of her big benefactors was Bing Crosby. And Bing Crosby actually purchased the adobe structure you saw in the first few slides. And he was into horse racing and raising horses. And he hired her to renovate and restore several barns on the property. And he really became a fan of hers and a supporter of hers over the years. Next slide, please. I like to end with a contemporary image so that you just don't see the past, that her buildings live on in time. They're beautiful. It's a wonderful enclave. It's a wonderful community. If ever you're afforded the opportunity to visit Rancho Santa Fe, I encourage it. So Lillian Rice, to me, influenced the way I view my practice, starting with a small woman-owned business, having the tenacity to start it and to stick with it, and to be able to find a path working with women and men to figure out what you want to do, what you do well, and keep doing it. So the next woman I want to highlight, next slide please, is Julia Morgan. And Julia Morgan is really, in my mind, phenomenal. I love Julia Morgan, and for many reasons, but I just want to give you some of her highlights. So Julia was born in 1872, and she died in 1957. She hails from San Francisco, California. She attended the University of California at Berkeley, and she holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. Again, that's because there was no School of Architecture, nor did the schools of architecture in that day admit women. So she graduated with honors with a civil engineering degree, and again, she worked with Bernard Maybeck, but also one of the head professors at UC Berkeley encouraged her to pursue a formal education at the École des Beaux-Arts in France, in Paris. And the École des Beaux-Arts at the turn of the last century was the preeminent education facility for any architect from around the world. One problem is they didn't admit women yet. So Julia went over to Paris, and she waited 4 years before she could take the exam and be admitted. And she petitioned, and there were other women there, 3 other American women who tried this, but were unsuccessful. But Julia, she stayed the course, and she petitioned, and she was admitted to take the exam, and then she was the first woman not only admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts, but the first to graduate from it. So a couple of her other accolades are she is the first female architect in the state of California to be licensed. She also is the first woman to have received the AIA Gold Medal. And you're going to be probably as upset as I am when you know when that happened. So remember, she died in 1957. She was awarded the gold medal posthumously in 2014. The first woman, 2014. Yeah. So she's a trailblazer, one that I look up to often. So the 3 projects really that I wanted to highlight, I sort of picked the 3 women and I started with their earlier work, their middle work, and then their opus, their legacy project. So for Julia, she's here in front of Notre Dame, so she stayed in Paris for 6 years. She returned to the United States, and she was able to sit for her licensing exam in around, I want to say it was around 1905, 1904. And she was practicing architecture with several other firms at the time, but she went off rather quickly to start her own company in 1904. Next slide, please. And so for Julia, her style, her architectural style, was more about the arts and crafts, and that is really aligned with Bernard Maybach, one of her mentors and one of her former employers. And so she was about tectonic and form, and she really felt that there needed to be a connection between the architectural space you occupied and the nature that surrounded it. So this is a building that is now named after her. It's a building on the campus of UC Berkeley. It actually sits in their botanical garden now, and it's called Julia Morgan Hall. And so it's one of her early works, and you can see the inside and the out. It's pure material. She didn't do a lot of heavy finishes, not a lot of overpainting or anything. You're seeing brick, you're seeing wood, you're seeing the structure for what it is. And remember, Julia had a civil engineering degree, so she was really, really forward-thinking in terms of structure. So you'll see in her first commission, next slide please, is a project for a small college called Mills College in Oakland, California. And they commissioned her to design sort of a showpiece or a centerpiece to their campus, a welcoming gate, so to speak. And so it's called El Campanil. And at the time, it was the tallest reinforced concrete structure in the state of California. And so remember, she's an engineer, so she figured out how to build it. It was designed and built, it was finally realized in 1904. It was open to the public. And if you remember, 1906 is the famous earthquake and fire that devastated the city of San Francisco. This building remained unscathed and really proved, it stood as a testament to her knowledge and her ability to engineer and design. The one sad thing is that she is not actually credited with this building. The contractor, who was a man, was actually given top billing for this. She was an associate designer on it. Yeah. Next slide, please. Another one of her buildings, and I should back up, so as Lillian sought out her camaraderie, friendship, community with women, so did Julia Morgan. And Julia really was a very quiet person, but a very determined person. And she created networks not only with colleagues who were also trying to pursue a profession, women, a profession in architecture, but also those that were working in other fields. So she really opened up her network to philanthropists and people who were involved in social causes. And so a lot of Julia's work includes buildings specifically designed for women organizations. And this is one. It's the Berkeley Women's Club, and it still exists to this day. It's stunning. It's been going through a series of restoration campaigns over the years, and it's truly magnificent. Next slide, please. So again, very simple. She's drawing from the architectural style of Adobe and of the California environment. She's exposing wood like the original Adobe structures would have had. She's not trying to pretend the building is doing something other than it is with its structure. So it's very true to its form. Next slide, please. What I did admire when I went to this building is it's very, I don't want to use the word complicated, but it's very, very well detailed. So you see her structural training again coming to life. You saw that last room was the dining room, the refectory. It's a large open space. So she was able to span that space structurally, unimpeded by columns or structure. Here she's using groin vaults to create these sort of intimate spaces of circulation around courtyards to bring in natural light. Next slide. And here's the swimming pool. She's done a lot of swimming pools in her career, and they're magnificent, but really they are structurally very challenging. So this is not on the ground floor, it's on the upper level, and it's one large groin vault spanning across. Next slide, please. So this is still a women's club, so that's what the pool looks like today. Still used regularly, a testament to her in terms of her engineering prowess and its ability to withstand years and years of use and maintenance. Next slide, please. So here she is, she's about 49 years old in this photo, and on the right is William Randolph Hurst. So one of Julia's greatest benefactors was William's mother, Phoebe Apperton Hurst. And Phoebe took a great interest in Julia before she went out on her own. She was one that was promoting her career, giving her confidence, and also helping her gain commissions. So with Phoebe's help, Julia designed over 17 YWCAs across the state of California. So many of the organizations that Phoebe was aligned with, she was promoting Julia to be the architect of these projects. So she introduced Julia to her son, William Randolph Hearst, and Julia designed his first headquarters in LA for the Hearst publications. In 1919, Phoebe passes away, and William inherits the entire Hurst estate. So he decides to, he and Julia got on famously, and he decides to ask Julia to help him design an enclave for he and his family. So I'll give you a little brief snippet about this before we go to the next slide. So his father, over time, collected over 280,000 acres in the Central Coast area, not far from Paso Robles, about 50 miles from Paso Robles. And the family would camp there. So there were, lean-tos, there were wooden structures on the property, a lot of animals, a lot of farming, but no structure, no running water, nothing like that. So he said to Julia, I'd like you to design a little cottage on the hill, something a little bit more comfortable for us to stay at. Next slide, please. And that's what came out of it. So this is San Simeon, or the Enchanted Hill as it's known. And this was Julia's, her legacy is greater than this, but this project went from 1919 to 1947. So for Hurst, for him, he was, as you might know, he was an infectious collector and builder and creator and visionary. And so he kept expounding upon his dream and his vision with Julia. But now imagine, so this is about, I don't know the distance in miles to tell you, but Julia lives in Berkeley, California. She is now, this was a design build project for her, so she's literally in the field drawing drawings with the builders to make design decisions. For her to get to this site is an 8-hour train trip to Paso Robles and then a 50-mile car ride to this property. Every time she's coming down to oversee the work, which went on for how many years? So that in itself is a labor of love. So next slide, please. So San Simeon, when I'm talking about her arts and crafts style and her influence, it's a little more Baroque over here. But it was really, truly one of those great stories between architect and client, where he entrusted her implicitly to build it for him. He would give her an idea, she would execute it, or she would come up with something better. And he never, I don't want to say ever, but they got along famously. He trusted her and he listened to her. And the result is quite stunning. It may not be of everyone's taste, but it is really quite a unique place to visit. So these are two images of cottages. So the cottage on the hill turned into what's Hurst Castle. But there were actually 3 cottages, one of which William Randolph Hearst actually lived in till the very end when he actually left the property around 1951 before he died. So he actually chose not to live in the castle any longer either. Next slide, please. So again, swimming pool, and not only one but 2. This is the interior swimming pool, which is this Moorish, gilded, just decadent swimming pool, which is really, really beautiful. Next slide, please. But if you didn't want to swim inside, you could swim outside. And this pool in and of itself just recently with the pandemic, I kind of skew my time frame. So before the pandemic, so it would have been 2020, it had just finished its restoration. So this pool is back to its beautiful glory, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. So this is Casa del Sol. So this is the cottage that William Randolph Hearst would live in up till near his death. He left the property. He was ill and he could no longer make the trip in 1951, and I believe he died around 1953. So this is, as you all, I'm sure, are well aware, this is the impetus for Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, and this would be Xanadu. Next slide, please. So that is the castle itself, and today it's owned by the state of California. The Hearst family actually dedicated it the year William Randolph Hearst passed away. They did pass it into ownership with the state of California, and many of the furnishings in his collections have been put into museums. Most of them are stored off-site, but the family took this rather ostentatious collection of things and made it a publicly accessible park site for everyone to come visit. So it's not as, when you're going through it, the furnishings aren't as elaborate as it would have been when William Randolph Hearst lived there, but you still get the sense of what it might be like. So it's quite a magnificent place. And structurally, again, where it is, what she had to do build this on the hill was extraordinary, not only in terms of engineering, but in terms of actually implementing work, getting materials and crew there. If it took her almost 2 days to get there from San Francisco, imagine what tons and tons of concrete, rebar, and workmen were like. So it's an extraordinary feat, and one that she deserves great credit for. Next slide, please. So my third pioneer that I look up to, I brought it a little closer to home here in New York. This is Natalie Dubloy. And Natalie Dubloy worked for Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill back at the time when they were really the prolific firm for modernism in the world. So this is a photo of Natalie. She was teaching, so she worked for Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill for 30 years. And then she just decided she was hitting that glass ceiling far too long. She decided to leave. And she went down. She actually traveled the world. She by bike, I might add. She went on a bike trip to Europe for 12 months. And she just saw the world. And she came back, and there were several other former SOM people who were working in Texas. So she went down to Texas to work with them, and she started teaching at the University of Texas, which she loved. She loved to teach, and she said she would have done it sooner had she been able to, but in the work world and the workforce of SOM, it didn't really provide her that avenue. So she really enjoyed it. She taught, of all things, a high-rise studio course at University of Texas, and she retired from teaching around the age of 78, 79. So she did it for a very long time. Next slide, please. So here's Natalie on the left with Nathaniel Owing of the Skidmore, the Owings, and the Merrill. And he was really the one who supported her. So for me, growing up as an architect, or a student in architecture, loved SOM, loved modernism, loved the next 3 buildings I'm about to show you, and was always led to believe they were designed by Gordon Bunshaft, which he had a hand in, no doubt, but she was the lead designer. And not only the designer, but she actually saw them through to construction. So she was in the field. So she does not get her glory. She does not get recognition. Nathaniel Owing did credit her, actually, at one point for being the most involved. But there's only one sighting of that kind of recognition, which is really, truly unfortunate. So on the right is probably one of the most, if not the most, iconic modernist structures in New York City, which is the Lever House, which she was the lead designer for. Next slide, please. And so it's unique in that it has this full block plaza that's elevated, and upon that sits a giant slab of glass and steel, which is magnificent. And so this is really the first application of curtain wall construction at this magnitude. And it in itself has gone through its own restoration over the years. And we're seeing well, we have hindsight. So curtain wall was new. It was being developed. It was being implemented on a grand scale. So part of the systematic failures that developed of the curtain wall system are now being recognized and repaired. So when it was restored, it was fully reskinned. So the whole exterior cladding was removed and put on with new materials and new technology to help it breathe and behave properly and last the test of time. So Lever House is really one of those beautiful, iconic buildings. Next slide. So here she is. I loved all these photos of her in working with men. This is one of her signature buildings that probably is her legacy in that this is the Pepsi Cola building on Park Avenue. And the reason I say that is all of the buildings that she's designing obviously are cutting edge modernism. And at the time frame where everyone is pushing the envelope in that direction, we're fighting against history, we're trying to remove ornament, we're trying to tear things down that have any relation to our past. And so this is the movement moving forward. But in terms of technology, what she was able to do on this building was design it with a particular manufacturer. So they were working with Cournier, who many of us may know now as the window people. But Cournier and SOM were working hand in hand to try and develop this whole exposed steel frame construction. And how do you do it? How do you make it? How do you fabricate it so that it's not a custom designed entity? And so she worked with them to get the steel to work with the glass, because she was using the glass at that time. That was the largest, 13 feet was the largest pane of glass that could be rolled, could be pressed. So when you look at the PepsiCo building, particularly at night, it glows like a jewel box. You rarely even notice the steel supports. She designed them so thin and delicately, it truly looks like it's a glass block floating above Park Avenue. So for that, she is recognized as really pushing the envelope, so to speak, no pun intended, on a modernist design. Next slide, please. So here it is in a more contemporary form. It did have an addition, which you can see peeking out on the right-hand side. It's a modern addition done by Polshek, James Polshek's firm, back in the 90s, and it's more of a masonry-clad structure. It's actually quite lovely the way it marries with the glass and steel. It doesn't compete with her design. It's really, truly of its time and different, but it still allows the original PepsiCo building to read as its own. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the interior spaces, courtyard looking out, and the lobby. So this idea that, you had this floating plane above you, that structure was more of an ephemeral identity, not necessarily confining you. So it's really, really quite lovely. You're drawn to the outside as much as the in. Next slide, please. And then her last big project while in the New York office was Union Carbide building, which is on was on Park Avenue between 47th and 48th. It's currently demolished. I don't believe it's fully gone now. It's been demolished for a larger skyscraper for J.P. Morgan Chase. So J.P. Morgan Chase bought it from Union Carbide. It became their flagship, their headquarter building, and they still own the property, and they are building something bigger. I won't say better, but they're building something bigger. So Union Carbide at the time was one of the tallest structures. Actually, it was the tallest structure in New York to use this technology. So again, Natalie is at the cutting edge of modernism, of structure, of technology, and innovation. Next slide, please. And so this, I absolutely love this building. I really do. And you see in this image, the signature detail is that she takes these I-beams and she puts them on the outside of the building. So the I-beams are all exposed now. So I would do this often before they put the turnstiles in for security. You could walk up to the building and you just look up, and you're looking up straight at an I-beam. You just see the structure rise up. So it's almost like she turned it inside out. And it's just lovely. But it is with us no more. And on the right is one of the very sort of prolific images of how tall it is when you see the Chrysler building in the background looking like a tiny little pencil stub next to this building. But also the interesting play. All of these buildings are on Park Avenue. All of these buildings are nestled between pre-war masonry buildings, and yet they all get along. So she really had a unique way of interpreting context in a time that was not so easy to interpret. That was really the turmoil of the 50s and 60s, and then we see the demolition, and you see the demise of some of the most beautiful parts of our city, and here she is looking at the city for its beauty and being inspired by it to create something new. So for that, I'm eternally grateful for her vision and how she pursued her work. From her personal side, she left the New York office and she went to Chicago because she was actually offered an associate partnership there after 20 some odd years of working with them. And she stayed in Chicago, but she never was offered a full partnership. So that's when she decided to leave and go it on her own. So I'm a big admirer, a big fan. So for her, I'm grateful to be in New York and to be able to see her beautiful creations pretty much anytime I want. Next slide, please. So these are some of her interiors. So all of the SOM interiors had a very beautiful simplicity and a luminescence in a way. Because of the structure, the ceiling heights were never very great, so the way they sort of played with you with light and illumination and tray ceilings where they could create height or the illusion of height was really quite magnificent, and she was a master at it. Next slide, please. So how does all that wrap up to me? So I've been inspired by all of these women and many, many others, as well as men. And so my love of architecture came very early. My father is an architect, and I was always inspired by what he did, and so he tried to discourage me from being an architect because he felt it was, I wouldn't get very far. He felt it was too much of a man's world. I had some percentages I wanted to give you for that statistic. So the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, they they've been charting this since around 1970, women in architecture. And so I think it was 1970, I'm going to say 1978. The percentage of women in architectural schools was 1%. In 2012, it went up to 13%. And right now, in the United States, 17% of all licensed architects are women. 17%. So we still have a long way to go, but there's many more of us. And I did share with Ken and John that statistically speaking, in the college realm now, it has tipped the scale. We're just over 50% women to men in the architectural schools. Let's see how that plays out in the future. But for me, I was inspired by modernism. That's the schooling that I went through. Yet I worked for several years, I got my license, and then I just felt a yearning for something more. I was working on projects where I was doing quite a bit of demolition in order to see new buildings constructed, and I felt that that was rather invasive, and there had to be another way. And so I decided to go back to graduate school for historic preservation, and it really changed my world. And so the kind of work I do now is new work, but always in historic or existing settings. So for me, I draw more inspiration by what I'm surrounded by, rather than just a clean slate. I'd rather be inspired or given direction and cues from what I need to coexist with. So some of my work goes from the industrial adaptive use like Brooklyn Bridge Park, to some galleries, to abandoned ruins and relics that we're trying to either stabilize and find a new use for rather than tear down, to working at places like this, glorious ecclesiastical structures. Next slide, please. So my firm, we developed a way of explaining our work, and we follow 3 guiding principles. Visionary design is the first, and so by that, we're taking our cues from context. We're taking our cues from history, and we're responding to current technology and current needs. So we try to seamlessly integrate new technology into historic environments on a daily basis. Next slide, please. And then our second sort of foundational principle, we'll call it, is responsible restoration. And so there you see the Parish House in the center. And by that I mean we're practicing according to the Secretary of the Interior's, which is our guiding standard in the United States, dictated to us by the National Park Service. And for us, and particularly on the Parish House, which I'll talk about in a minute, we also follow the American Institute of Conservation standards. So by that, we are trying to maintain and protect as much of the original historic fabric as possible, and not try and remove it or replace it with something contemporary. Next slide, please. And our third principle is expert methodology. And so by this, I mean the way we practice. So our firm, we're up to 15 people now. We are predominantly women. We do have a couple men now. But we prescribe to a very particular methodology, which starts first and foremost with history. So we look at research, we look at archival research, we look at the physical research. By that I mean touching the building, surveying the building, doing non-invasive testing to understand what it is we're working on. And from there we develop a methodology of assessing the conditions that we're working with and prescribing recommendations and prioritize recommendations that respond to the deterioration needs, the mechanisms at work for deterioration and damage, and conditions that require restoration, preservation, or rehabilitation. So that's where our methodology is rooted, and we put into practice on all of our structures. Next slide, please. So I'll just delve a little bit into my relationship with St. Anne and the Holy Trinity, which has been going on. Claudia and I were just talking about this. It's a decade now. And I was brought here to work on the Parish House. And so we did the exterior restoration of the Parish House, and that concluded, it was about 2013 to about 2015 by the time it was actually completed. And by that we did, I'll roll through a couple of the slides in a minute, but we did everything from anything that was related to the exterior envelope. So the roofing, the flashing, brickwork, brownstone work, windows, doors, and appurtenances like fire escapes and things like that. Next slide, please. So I show you this image on the right because, as you probably all well know, Menard Lefevre was the architect of the St. Anne and the Holy Trinity complex. And by that, historically, it's known as 3 separate buildings, which would be the church, the chapel, and the rectory. And we call the parish house, but it's actually combining the chapel and the rectory. And so the image on the right is the original iteration of the rectory, which is the 2.5-story building, and the chapel to its right, which is now a 2-story building. But I give you the image because the watercolor from Lefevre from the 1840s is very similar to what still exists today. The iterations of change we'll talk about in a minute, but in terms of the exterior building fabric, it's all there. It's 100% real, which is the point. I like to say when I've done my restoration work effectively, you never knew I was there. It should look like it was originally designed. Next slide, please. So these are some photos taken during the restoration work. So on the right, we put back a couple of those finials, the upside-down finials. We cast them out of stone, and we attached them with stainless steel pins back. We tooled back all of the exfoliating material, delaminating material back to the original brownstone. There was some brownstone replacement, some patching, some pointing, but we used a technique guided by the American Institute of Conservation, which is tooling. So by that, we scarified with a very delicate handheld tool, chipped away that part of the surface that was delaminating. So now it's down to sound stone. So it's the original brownstone still exposed. Next slide, please. So these are images after completion. So when you're looking at them, you look up and you look at the building now, the surface isn't pure plain. It isn't flat. You'll see these variations because it's where the tooling happened. And when we tool it, we have to tool a watershed so that water will direct off the building and not collect. So it's not perfect in any means, but it's beautiful. And it's the original stone, and it's a repair technique that will last 50 to 100 years, rather than putting in a patching compound or something like that, which is also reputable, but it has its time and its place. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight the overall. So we dealt with every facade of the parish house. So these are the firescapes in the rear, the courtyard elevations, pointing, cleaning, sill work, lintel work. Next slide, please. And then the roof, one of the most important parts. So there's several roofs, obviously, to the parish house. We have the sloped roof that faces Montague, and we have the flat roofs on the majority of the building, which we replaced with a contemporary waterproofing membrane. So here's where we brought in new technology to work with the old building. So we're giving you sort of the 50-year fix with new materials that are not seen. The roof, for example, replacing all the coping stones, rebuilt all the skylights back to their original detail. Next slide, please. And then some of the close-up work where on the lower right, you'll see the port, there's a seam in the middle of that image. This piece of stone to the left is a new piece of brownstone, and the piece of stone to the right is an existing piece of brownstone. And by new brownstone, I mean it's recycled from a salvage yard in the Bronx. It's not as if this was quarried for us. This is recycled from another building that we repurposed here for our use. Next slide, please. So the windows, the glorious windows, which were in terrible, terrible condition, you see here. I'm just going to show you a few slides of their resuscitation. Next slide, please. So here's stripping it down to bare wood to really assess how much of the wood needs to be treated, doing some paint analysis you see on the right to figure out what the original paint color would have been. This all went to the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Next slide, please. And then we started to epoxy repair the wood. So the wood that's there on those beautiful traceries is all the original wood, with the exception of 2 feet at the bottom of each window where we cut it back and put a new piece of mahogany in where it sits near the windowsill, which takes in the most water. The wood there was too far gone to try and salvage, so we cut it back and married a new piece of mahogany in. But this is the love and care that took place with the contractors. On the left is the epoxy going in. It's almost like a wood bondo, for lack of a better term. It's a wood epoxy that seals, it creates some moisture, it brings the wood back together and creates a surface that you sand. And on the right, you see the sanding and the priming. That is a labor of love. It's layers and layers and layers of sanding and then priming, and then sanding it again and priming it till it comes back to a solid piece of wood. Next slide. And then here's the finish coat going on of paint. Next slide. And here are the interior windows, so all new sash with laminated glass so that they're soundproof and offer some thermal heat transmission as well. So it's improving the thermal quality of the windows. Next slide, please. And some intensive restoration of the arsenic glass window. We call it the frog eye window with the tilting windows, but beautifully done, beautifully done. And the exterior too, the pointing and the wood frame brought back to life. Next slide, please. And that is the finished product of the restoration. So from that, we're going to go into the church and a little bit about the history of the church so you can understand the iterations of change that have happened. As I mentioned, our philosophy and our methodology is to start with history and research and to take it into our current condition and to understand the morphology or the evolution of change, because a lot of that has to do with the condition of the building we're facing. A lot of either alterations may have happened that may have exceeded their useful life or perhaps even been inappropriate in their use. Next slide, please. So we'll go back in time a little bit. Menard Lefevre was the architect of this beautiful church. It is his magnum opus. It was finished after his death, unfortunately, but it is a glorious, glorious church. Designed in, as I said, 1844 to about 1856 was when it was fully realized. And so the church and the rectory and the chapel were going on simultaneous. And the idea was that the chapel would be finished so that a place of worship could be established. And then it was brought, when I was reading it just today on my way here, when the tower was at its third floor, they had service in the chapel, and they allowed the parishioners to come in and view the progress of the church once the tower got to that point. So a magnificent labor of love and craft and benefactors and artwork and stained glass and the organ. Everything in this church is in and of itself a work of art. And it is listed, as you probably all know, it's listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It is a National Historic Landmark, the highest designation in the country, and it is in the National Register Historic District of Brooklyn Heights. It's in the local historic district for the Landmarks Commission, and a local landmark as well. So it has every possible level of recognition, I'll say. So I show the image on the left because these are, both of them actually, these are from Menard Lefevre's sketchbook. They're watercolors from his office when they were designing the church. And you see the tower, which you probably all remember the tower. That does not look like this anymore. Next slide. And so here's a drawing that's very interesting because the tower itself, the spire, is there. But the way they drew it was as if it were coming in a future phase, which it indeed did. It came, I want to say, about 30 years after the completion of the church. The spire was put on. But an interesting drawing in that you see again the original configuration of the one-story chapel next to the rectory. Next slide, please. And so here's that historic photo again, which I love. And here we have our two-story space. So the chapel on the ground floor and what would become, they intended it to be a community space where the second tracery window above the chapel. And the rectory at that point had been modified. It was around 1897. So the rectory and the chapel opened in 1845 and 1846, respectively. And the addition, second story addition, and the modification where the stoop was removed and the center entrance was put on the rectory came in 1897. Next slide, please. These are a few of our images of taking the original drawings, and when we do our existing conditions, we associate a different hatch or a different color to a different type of condition that we're observing. So it just gives you an overall sense of the mechanisms of deterioration at play on a drawing elevation. And we take that and we turn that into construction documents. Next slide, please. So we recently were asked to complete an existing conditions assessment update for the church exterior. So we spent a couple of days with a contractor with a boom lift, and we were on the roofs, we were on the scaffold, and we were in the boom, observing the conditions of the facade up close and personal. And so Lefevre chose two different types of brownstone when the church was built. So one comes from Connecticut and one comes from New York. And we experienced that doing the restoration of the parish house. The chapel piece is one, and the rectory was the other. So we couldn't share. We had to get 2 types of salvaged brownstone for each. The windows, as you know, are the first figural painted stained glass windows in the United States. The organ is of its own historic integrity and importance. So all of this needs protection. And the first point of departure is the exterior envelope. So that's why we were looking at what's happening, because we're watching the active deterioration of brownstone. It's a natural occurrence. It's a natural material. Every building needs to be maintained. You don't build it and walk away from it. Every building, even Natalie Dubloy's steel and glass one, they need to be maintained as well. So looking at the church, we identified the different components, so the masonry components, roof and drainage components, wood window components. And we came up with a set of conditions that we've assessed, and we've come up with a series of prioritized recommendations. So there's no point of the church, or there's no area of the church that does not require some sort of repair or maintenance. So it's in a state of ongoing deterioration, and one that we need to actively recognize and start to create a plan for treating. So I'm going to show you a few images so you can see the conditions. This is looking from the boom, looking back over the slate roof and back toward the tower. Next slide, please. And that's a great one from straight up above. And so the slate roof is in very good shape. There are areas of detaching slate, but the roof itself is very sound. It appears watertight. So that's a good thing. And the side aisles as well. They've been replaced with grant money over the years, which is also wonderful. So that's an important piece to tackle. Next slide, please. And then the overall, this is a great view of the side. So the church itself has been a test program for many restoration campaigns, going back as early as 1905, 1906. Actually, the only comprehensive restoration of the church occurred in 1905 and 1906. Everything since then has been implemented in a case-by-case repair. So we see areas where stone has been replaced. We see where ornament has been removed, or ornament has been replaced with a cast ornament or a patching compound. We see areas where pointing has been done, and some of it ineffectively. So we're now seeing, as I mentioned, we have hindsight. We can see the test of time, and we can see what's in need of attention sooner rather than later. So this is a good image where you can kind of see that it's a patchwork, or you see the different colorations of stone where treatments have happened. So we're going to go up close and personal in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So here's some of the when I say delamination, so the stone actually peels away in layers. And it's an inherent problem with sandstone. It's sometimes just based on when it was constructed. When brownstone comes out of the ground, it's a sedimentary rock, so that means it's formed in layers under high heat and pressure, and so it's a horizontal laying, they call it a bedding plane, and when it comes out of the ground, it's a very tight grain. You can't necessarily see it, so masons oftentimes will lay it opposing the bedding plane, meaning that all those layers are now this way, and so when water gets in, they kind of peel away like layers of skin. So that is an inherent problem just in the construction technology. It's not a failure of anyone doing their job wrong. It's just, they didn't have the wherewithal or understand the stone enough to put it in its correct orientation. Next slide, please. But there are just mechanisms of deterioration here. We have biological growth. So this attaches to the building because there's moisture trapped in the stone. These are shady sides, the north side of the building. So you're prolonging and proliferating this sort of fertile ground for biological growth and for mechanisms of deterioration to take hold. Next slide, please. Here's some exfoliation, some sugaring, some material loss, and this is on the tower primarily. Next slide, please. And some more disintegration of stone around the joints. So some of these joints were pointed with a harder mortar over the years. And as that mortar is harder than the stone is what fails. The water finds its way out. Pieces of ornament you see in the foreground on the left our finial is missing its crocket, because that crocket, which is that ornamental top piece, was probably either falling off or in jeopardy of falling off, so it was easier to remove it. So there's a lot of extraction of pieces and parts of this beautiful building, but we do have a nice collection of it here in the yard. Everything we've taken off, we've kept. I don't want to say a graveyard, but we do have a nice stockpile. Next slide, please. And this is the beautiful garden wall to the north, which is absolutely stunning. And it's just one of those features that, because it's not part of the church, I fear it has been neglected over time, and is now in a state of severe disrepair that really needs time and attention. Next slide, please. Some of the colonnettes surrounding the entry on the right. And so that is areas where the stone is failing in a way. So this is tooling what is failing off the building, getting it down to sound material. But there comes a point when you can't tool any longer, when you're actually going to start to lose building section of what's structurally supporting the stone. So we have to be careful of how long we let this go without being treated. Next slide, please. And just some inappropriate repairs over time, and see what happens with again, the understanding the technology of material and thinking about Julia Morgan and Lillian Rice. They're pre-World War II. I guess so was Natalie for a while. So we have a whole different state of production of material, of technology before World War II. So whenever steel was introduced into a building, before we galvanize it, it's exposed and it's ferrous, which means water hits it, it rusts, it creates this popping of the stone. So we have this kind of pinning connection not infrequently, unfortunately. Next slide. And then just some of the areas that had been treated. So in the 70s and 80s, there were a few conservation campaigns here that were well-intended and executed flawlessly. The problem is that some of the materials and the techniques, they have a lifespan. And so once that material reaches its useful life, it starts to fail, and that's what you're seeing here. So these were forms laid to create ornament and create molding using a patching compound. And so they have now exceeded their useful life in this location. Next slide, please. Just a couple of other areas on the building. The right, you see that sort of washing away of the stone, and you're seeing the setting stone and the setting mortar behind. That's an area of concern. On the left, I show that because you see the different colors, and the different colors are indicating real stone, but also patching. So patching is cementitious patching, and it's using crushed brownstone into the mix, so you get the same coloration, but over time it breaks down under UV light, so it starts to fade into those various shades of pink. So that's what you're seeing there on the left. Next slide, please. And so here we also have, as you know, 59 windows that we have to deal with, and 59 window surrounds that we have to deal with. And so they're suffering from various levels of deterioration. I think the south is a bit worse than the north. The north has a little bit of protection, but all do need to be treated, especially the wood, because it is bare now and exposed. Next slide, please. So a couple of close-ups. So the wood is there, it's beautiful. The ornament and decoration is stunning. And we still have time to keep it and do what we did on the Parish House. But time is of the essence. Next slide, please. Just a couple more close-ups. Next slide, please. So that's one of my stockpiles of material when we were on the boom that we could remove. Cleaned out the gutters while we were up there. But just brought down any missing or moving ornament that we thought was in jeopardy of detaching. Next slide, please. So that is it in a nutshell. I did not mention, I brought that image before you with the tower, the spire, which had a lifespan of, I believe, 36 years, 35 years before it was taken down in 1906. So magnificent spire, but it's been a capped, virtually flat roof on the tower ever since. So that is what we're working with in conceiving our restoration plan. Next slide, please. So our building envelope is what protects our gorgeous interior. So this magnificent space warrants restoration and preservation and living on for generations to come. Next slide. Grand finale. Oh, not yet. Just the magnificence. I mean, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, literally, right? With all of you here who come here to enjoy the space and the light and the beautiful character that is embodied in the space. So the last slide, please. I'll leave you with that. And Our intention is to work continually for however many decades more we need to work to implement a restoration plan, multi-phased, and try and get this off the ground so we can maintain the building for the future. Thank you.
I can't thank you enough, Lisa. We probably could sit here all afternoon. I'm not sure who called in the drums, but maybe they know something that we don't. And we did intend to create an opportunity for some questions, and I probably will limit them, but if there's anyone with a burning question, I can bring a microphone to you. You don't have to come up. But since Lisa's here, if anybody was thinking anything along the way about either some of the pioneering women in the field of architecture or about our church, I will say, if you want to take a minute to think about that, and it's absolutely fine, I'm sure, to all, if we don't do any questions. But one of the things I was reminded of as Lisa gave her presentation is how incredibly smart she is, and how easily she talks about things that don't make any sense to me at all. And I sometimes think when she's talking that I don't actually know English because I don't know what she's saying. But I'm getting better at it. I think I understood a lot more today than I have in the past when you've talked about the building. No, but it really is remarkable. I will say I had a moment of some joy thinking about it, because often when we talk about, certainly since the Parish House restoration, and by the way, it should be said that Lisa also led the charge when we had a plaster issue with our plaster here inside of the sanctuary and needed to close the sanctuary and do a plaster stabilization project that Lisa led us through. So you didn't mention that, but that is another way that you have dealt very passionately and personally with the building. Anyway, in the course of talking about the exterior, when you first came and we were discussing the Parish House, and then since we've been talking about the exterior of the church, you have used a lot of the terms you used today about delamination and vulnerability, and but you today on one slide you use the term sugaring, and I thought I can go with sugaring. The facade is sugaring, and we need some sugar to help us address that problem. But that reminds me to say, so Lisa talked a lot about and showed us some wonderful slides from of Menard Lefevre's. This is the crown jewel of his oeuvre. And he was also, did not live a terribly long life. He, if I understood right, or understand correctly, he was self-taught, and he was very prolific, but this really is is sort of the first among his great body of work. And anyway, I forgot what I was going to say. So the building, she talked about dates and to do with this building, but we understand the building to have opened, and I don't know if this is what you were talking about when you said people were able to come in from the chapel, but we understand the doors having opened in 1847, which means this year is the 175th anniversary of this building being open for use. And although it's been closed twice over the course of time, in my mind, it's been open for 175 years. And we will continue to celebrate this anniversary. The date of the opening of the church is April 25th, 1847. So at the end of April is when our official anniversary happens. And if all goes according to plan, at least in this little brain of mine, we'll continue to mark this anniversary throughout the year. But I think of this presentation as the first, really the launch of our anniversary celebration. So thank you very much for helping us begin this observation, if you will. And you did show us, beyond the sugaring, the state of the building, and it is remarkable and somewhat concerning, but because you're on board with us, we feel a sense of hopefulness and forward movement now, and it's really wonderful. Some of you know that we received a $250,000 grant from the National Fund for Sacred Places in the fall of 2021, and we have 18 months to raise twice as much to receive a grant. And Lisa, I don't think you said this so definitively, but Lisa mentioned that every part of the church building will need to be some preservation work, but in the phased work that she has laid out, we're going to begin with the tower. So the tower restoration project is first. And although we need to raise $500,000 to match the $250,000, we'll need another couple of million plus to do that work. So we've got some work ahead of us, but we've got a lot of hope about reaching our goal. Okay, I've given you a lot of time to think about questions. Yes, okay, hold on.
First of all, thank you so much. Everything was just absolutely fascinating to me. Do you know, in terms of the parish hall and the chapel, why it was built not to the original sketches that he
Oh, no,
did?
it was. It actually was, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It was. So it was a one-story chapel, and Carlos, can you go back a few slides, and I'll tell you when to stop? Looking for that watercolor, it's got a picture of the parish house on the left and the watercolor on the right. So it's going to be pretty close to the beginning of the church presentation part. So it was built. It had a stoop. It had a right side entry. Right, one more. It was before this, yeah, right. Right there, okay. So this image on the right is what it looked like when it was built. So it had a right entry for the rectory. It had a stoop with it was offset, and a one-story chapel. And then in 1897, they redid the interior. They took the stoop away. They lengthened the windows to grade, and they added a second story on top of the chapel to what you see. Can you go forward now, Carlos? Keep going. Right there. Oh, back. Yep, right there. So here's the two-story. And the stoop was here. And they brought, so these windows, those are the original frames, and they just put a transom in and dropped the windows to grade. And they did a major renovation of the interior. So it was built originally like this and then modified. So it was modified twice, in 1897 and then again in 1904 to 1907.
So I'm going to ask, you're saying this was added?
Yeah, your old office was added.
Wow.
Yeah. That was the addition.
Anyone else?
I just appreciate the talk so much. It was really super fantastic. I'm really glad that I made it.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you did too.
But I've heard of, I don't know if it's restoration, but there's like a tacky material that's like fiberglass and foam or something.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of
wonder
that.
if you ever use that kind of thing.
No. Never. Mm-mm. Nope.
Any other questions for Lisa?
I did want to say, when you were mentioning Lefevre, it was truly his work, his greatest work. And just a little anecdote, when we were doing the parish house, we had a difficult time with the Landmarks Commission convincing them that there was never stained glass windows in the front of the building. So we had to prove it. So research. So we found at Avery Library Menard Lefevre's notebook. And in his notebook, he's describing the fact that we can't put stained glass in here because it's unusual to orient the chapel east-west. So it's very dark, so I want the two ends of the chapel to have clear glass, and then we're going to put skylights over it so we can get natural daylight in. So that was really telling. So this notebook of his, But he described this high Gothic architectural style in New York as being very modern and forward-thinking. 1844, right? And then here's Natalie Dubloy 100 years later, and that's what's modern and forward-thinking, right? It's so interesting. But it's a great find to find that notebook, and hence we found a couple of those watercolors. But also his thinking on how to treat the design, the problems that he was struggling with to solve, where he narratively addressed them, which is great.
Jacqueline, do we ever have the last word?
Yes, I just want to thank you for this fabulous presentation. My question is, where did you see Lefebvre's notebooks? Did you have to go to the diocese? Did you have to go to Long Island?
No, we went to Avery, so Columbia University School of Architecture. They have a rare books collection and archive. That's where we found the notebook.
I think you may have just said Avery, but I don't think people
Yeah.
understood that was, yeah.
Yeah, so Columbia University's architecture school is Avery, and the Avery Library is it's the world-renowned. It's, if not the best in the world, it's one of the best in the world. And they have a rare books collection, and they also house the archives of many, many architects. Over time, they're dedicated and donated to the school, and they're preserved in archival form. So that's where we found it.
I asked for fundraising reasons. We have to raise a lot of money for this building. And if we could have an exhibition of the architectural drawings, the incipient work,
That's
that
a
I
great
think
idea.
would be very good for fundraising.
That's a great idea.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. That's why we keep you around. Okay, so without further ado then, I think I will send us off and actually send Lisa off to get a little lunch, which she didn't get a chance to have. But please, will you please help me thank Lisa with a great big round of applause. Thank you. And then we will have this archived on our website, and we hope there were lots of folks at home, but if folks couldn't make it, please let them know that they can watch by going to our website, stannholytrinity.org. And I don't know if for all your work, Lisa, this building or any part of it will be renamed, the Lisa Easton Memorial Church or anything, but we will have you on record in our archives. Yeah, a piece of slate. Okay, before we get into our little cocktail hour chat here, have a blessed afternoon, and thank you for being here. God bless you.